The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Afghan village as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her medical kit one final time. At 28, she had already served 3 tours of duty, but something about today felt different. The intelligence reports had been sketchy at best, and the local contacts seemed more nervous than usual. "Santos, you ready?" called out Major David Richardson, her commanding officer. Richardson was a veteran of countless operations, a man who had earned his rank through grit and determination rather than political connections. His weathered face showed the strain of command, but his eyes still held the sharp focus that had kept his unit alive through some of the most dangerous missions in the region. "Always ready, sir," Maria replied, checking her rifle one last time before slinging it across her back. As a combat medic, her primary weapon was her medical training, but in these hostile territories, every soldier needed to be prepared for anything. The village of Kalina had been experiencing increased insurgent activity over the past few weeks. Local leaders had requested assistance in establishing a medical clinic, and Maria's unit had been tasked with providing security while she assessed the medical needs of the population. It seemed like a routine humanitarian mission, the kind that reminded soldiers why they had joined the service in the first place. The convoy moved through the narrow streets slowly, with Richardson's team of 12 soldiers maintaining a defensive formation. Maria rode in the second vehicle, her mind already focused on the medical supplies she would need to distribute and the patients she might encounter. She had learned early in her career that preparation was everything, and she prided herself on being ready for any medical emergency. As they approached the designated meeting point near the village center, Maria noticed that the usual sounds of daily life were absent. No children playing in the streets, no merchants hawking their wares, no elderly men sitting in the shade discussing politics. The silence was oppressive, like a heavy blanket that muffled even the sound of their vehicles. "Something's not right," Richardson muttered into his radio, his instincts honed by years of combat experience. "Eyes up, everyone. Stay alert." The vehicles came to a stop near a compound that was supposed to house the temporary medical clinic. Maria gathered her supplies, mentally preparing for what she hoped would be a successful day of treating patients and building trust with the local community. She had always believed that medicine could bridge cultural divides, that caring for people's health was a universal language that transcended politics and conflict. As the team began to dismount, Maria noticed movement in the windows of surrounding buildings. At first, she thought it might be curious villagers, but something about the way the shadows shifted made her stomach tighten with apprehension. Her medical training had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming danger. Richardson was the first to step out of the lead vehicle, his rifle at the ready, but not raised. He believed in showing strength while avoiding unnecessary provocation. His approach had served him well in previous missions, earning him the respect of both his subordinates and the local populations he had worked with. The compound's gates stood slightly ajar, which violated the security protocols they had established with the village elders. According to their intelligence briefing, the gates should have been wide open with local officials waiting to greet them. Instead, the courtyard appeared empty, and an unsettling quiet hung over the entire area. Maria's training kicked in as she scanned the surroundings for potential medical threats, as well as security concerns. She noted the positions of cover, the fastest routes to safety, and the locations where wounded personnel could be treated if the situation deteriorated. It was second nature to her now, this constant assessment of tactical medical considerations. The first sign of trouble came from the rooftops. A flash of reflected sunlight from a rifle scope caught Richardson's attention just seconds before the first shots rang out. The carefully planned ambush erupted with devastating suddenness, transforming the quiet morning into a chaos of gunfire and shouting. Richardson immediately began coordinating his team's response, his voice cutting through the noise with calm authority. Years of training had prepared him for this moment, and he moved with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned combat leader. His first priority was getting his people to cover and establishing a defensive perimeter. Maria hit the ground behind their vehicle as bullets whined overhead, her medical instincts already assessing the situation for potential casualties. She could hear Richardson calling out orders, directing his men to defensive positions while trying to establish communication with their base. The ambush had been well planned, with insurgents positioned in multiple buildings surrounding their position. The firefight intensified quickly, with enemy fire coming from at least 3 different directions. Richardson's team was outnumbered and caught in an exposed position, but their training and discipline kept them from panicking. They returned fire with measured precision, trying to suppress the enemy long enough to either break contact or call in support. From her position behind the vehicle, Maria could see that several of her teammates were pinned down in exposed positions. The insurgents had chosen their ambush site well, using the narrow streets and tall buildings to create a killing field that made movement extremely dangerous. Every time one of Richardson's men tried to advance to better cover, they were met with intense gunfire. Richardson himself was positioned near the front of the formation, where he could best direct his team's response. Maria watched as he moved from position to position, checking on his men and coordinating their defensive fire. His leadership was keeping the unit together, but she could see that their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the surrounding buildings, creating a deafening cacophony that made communication difficult. Maria pressed herself against the vehicle's armored side, her medical kit clutched tightly in her hands. She knew that casualties were inevitable in this kind of firefight, and she needed to be ready to act the moment someone needed medical attention. As the battle raged around her, Maria felt a strange mixture of fear and determination. This was what she had trained for, the moment when her medical skills could mean the difference between life and death for her fellow soldiers. The academic exercises and simulation training had prepared her technically, but nothing could truly prepare someone for the reality of combat medicine under fire. The insurgents seemed to have unlimited ammunition, and their fire was becoming more accurate as they adjusted to the defensive positions Richardson's team had taken. Maria could hear the distinctive crack of sniper rounds mixed in with the automatic weapons fire, indicating that the enemy had positioned skilled marksmen to target anyone who exposed themselves. Richardson's voice continued to cut through the chaos, directing fire and trying to identify escape routes. His calm professionalism was infectious, helping to keep his team focused despite the overwhelming enemy fire. Maria had always respected Richardson as a leader, but seeing him in action under these conditions gave her a new appreciation for his capabilities. The battle had been raging for nearly 20 minutes when Maria heard the sound that every combat medic dreads, a wounded soldier calling for help. The cry came from somewhere near Richardson's position, and she knew that someone needed immediate medical attention. This was the moment she had trained for, when her skills as a medic would be put to the ultimate test. The call for a medic came from Specialist Johnson, one of Richardson's youngest soldiers. Maria could see him through the dust and smoke, pinned down behind a concrete barrier about 50 meters from her position. Blood was visible on his uniform, and his movements suggested he had taken a serious hit to his leg. Without hesitation, Maria began preparing for what would be one of the most dangerous medical evacuations of her career. The space between her position and Johnson's was completely exposed to enemy fire, with no cover except for a few scattered pieces of debris. Every instinct told her to wait for the gunfire to subside, but her medical training overrode her survival instincts. "Johnson's hit," she called out to Richardson, who was coordinating suppressive fire from a position about 30 meters away. The major turned toward her, his face grim with the realization that they now faced an even more complex tactical situation. A wounded soldier changes everything in combat, creating both a medical emergency and a tactical liability that can compromise the entire unit. Richardson immediately began organizing covering fire to support Maria's movement to Johnson's position. He called out coordinates to his remaining soldiers, directing them to focus their fire on the windows and rooftops where the enemy shooters were positioned. The volume of return fire increased noticeably as Richardson's team worked to suppress the ambush. Maria took a deep breath and prepared to make the dash to Johnson's position. Her medical kit was secured tightly to her back, and she had her rifle ready in case she needed to defend herself during the movement. The 50 meters ahead of her might as well have been 50 miles, given the intensity of the crossfire filling the space between the two positions. "Go, Santos! We've got you covered," Richardson shouted over the gunfire. His team immediately increased their rate of fire, trying to keep the enemy shooters from taking accurate shots at Maria as she moved across the exposed ground. Maria sprinted from cover, her boots pounding against the dusty street as bullets cracked through the air around her. The sound of her own breathing seemed impossibly loud despite the chaos of battle raging around her. Time seemed to slow down as she focused entirely on reaching Johnson's position, her medical training pushing her forward despite the obvious danger. Halfway to Johnson's position, Maria felt a bullet pass so close to her head that she could feel the displacement of air. She dove forward, rolling behind a small pile of rubble that provided minimal cover, but at least broke her silhouette against the enemy fire. From this position, she could see Johnson more clearly, and the extent of his injuries became apparent. The specialist had taken a rifle round to his upper leg, and the wound was bleeding heavily. Even from 20 meters away, Maria could see that he was going into shock, his face pale and his movements becoming increasingly sluggish. She knew that he needed immediate medical attention or he would bleed out within minutes. The enemy fire seemed to intensify as Maria prepared for the final sprint to Johnson's position. The insurgents had clearly identified her as a high-value target, and they were concentrating their fire on her probable route of movement. Richardson's team was doing their best to provide covering fire, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. Maria made the final dash to Johnson's position in a low crouch, zigzagging to make herself a more difficult target. She reached the concrete barrier just as a burst of automatic weapons fire shattered the wall behind, where she had been standing moments before. The proximity of the near miss reminded her just how precarious their situation had become. "Hey, Johnson, I'm here," Maria said as she slid into position beside the wounded soldier. Her voice was calm and professional, designed to reassure the patient while she began her initial assessment. Johnson's eyes were unfocused, and his breathing was rapid and shallow, classic signs of traumatic shock. The leg wound was worse than Maria had initially thought. The bullet had struck Johnson's femoral artery, causing massive bleeding that was already soaking through his uniform. She immediately applied direct pressure to the wound while reaching for her medical supplies with her free hand. Time was critical, and she had to work quickly to prevent Johnson from bleeding to death. While Maria worked on Johnson's wound, the firefight continued to rage around them. Richardson was trying to coordinate an organized withdrawal while maintaining enough defensive fire to keep the insurgents from overrunning their position. His voice could be heard clearly over the gunfire, calm and professional despite the desperate nature of their situation. Maria applied a tourniquet above Johnson's wound, tightening it until the bleeding stopped. The specialist was barely conscious now, his body shutting down from blood loss and trauma. She started in 4-line to replace the fluids he was losing while continuing to monitor his vital signs. Her movements were quick and efficient, the result of countless hours of training and several previous combat medical situations. "How is he, Santos?" Richardson called out from his position. The major was still directing his team's defensive fire, but Maria could hear the concern in his voice. Johnson was not just another soldier under his command. He was a young man who had trusted Richardson to bring him home safely. "He's stable for now, but he needs immediate evacuation," Maria replied. The tourniquet had stopped the bleeding, but Johnson needed surgery within the hour or he would lose his leg. More importantly, he was still in danger of going into irreversible shock if they couldn't get him to a medical facility quickly. Richardson's response was immediate and decisive. He began coordinating with their base to arrange for emergency medical evacuation while simultaneously trying to organize his team for a fighting withdrawal from their current position. The complex tactical problem of moving a wounded soldier under fire would test every aspect of his leadership skills. The enemy seemed to sense that the American soldiers were preparing to move, and their fire increased in intensity. Maria could hear the distinctive whistle of mortars being fired from somewhere in the distance, adding another layer of danger to their already desperate situation. The insurgents were clearly well-equipped and well-trained, making this far more dangerous than a typical ambush. As Maria continued treating Johnson, she became aware that Richardson had moved closer to their position. The major was now only about 10 meters away, directing fire and tried to establish a secure route for their withdrawal. His presence provided some comfort, but it also meant that he was exposing himself to increased danger. "Sir, you need to get back to cover," Maria called out to Richardson. As the unit's commanding officer, his safety was crucial to everyone's survival. If something happened to him, the entire team would be in even greater danger than they already faced. Richardson ignored her warning, continuing to direct his team's defensive efforts while moving between positions to check on his soldiers. This was the kind of leadership that had earned him the loyalty of his troops, but Maria knew it was also the kind of behavior that could get him killed. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance gave everyone hope that medical evacuation was on the way. However, the aircraft would not be able to land in their current position due to the intense enemy fire. Richardson would have to get his team to a more secure landing zone while protecting a wounded soldier, a tactical challenge that would test every aspect of his training and experience. Maria finished stabilizing Johnson as best she could under the circumstances. The specialist was unconscious but breathing, and his vital signs had stabilized enough for transport. Now came the most dangerous part of the operation, moving him to safety while under enemy fire. Richardson appeared at Maria's side, his face covered with dust and sweat, but his eyes still sharp and focused. "We need to move now," he said quietly. "The extraction point is 200 meters south, but will be completely exposed for the last 100 meters. The plan was simple, but extremely dangerous. Richardson's team would provide covering fire while Maria and 2 other soldiers carried Johnson to the extraction point. The major would coordinate the movement while maintaining defensive fire against the insurgents who were still trying to overrun their position. As they prepared to move, Maria couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. She had come to this village to provide medical care to local civilians, but now she was fighting for the life of one of her own soldiers while under fire from the very people they had come to help. The movement to the extraction point began with Richardson's team laying down the heaviest volume of suppressive fire they could manage with their remaining ammunition. Maria and Corporal Martinez grabbed Johnson under his arms while Sergeant Williams took his legs, and the 3-person carry team began moving toward the landing zone as quickly as they could manage. The first 50 meters went smoothly, with the team using a series of connected buildings to provide cover from the enemy fire. Johnson remained unconscious, which was both a blessing and a concern for Maria. The blessing was that he couldn't feel the pain of being moved roughly over uneven ground. The concern was that his condition might be deteriorating faster than she had initially assessed. Richardson maintained his position near the rear of the formation, directing covering fire and ensuring that none of his soldiers were left behind in the withdrawal. His tactical experience was evident in the way he managed the movement, using terrain features and timing to minimize his team's exposure to enemy fire. As they reached the halfway point to the extraction zone, the enemy fire began to intensify again. The insurgents had apparently repositioned some of their fighters to intercept the American withdrawal, and they were now firing from new positions that hadn't been previously identified. Richardson immediately adjusted his team's defensive plan, redirecting fire to suppress these new threats. Maria could hear the helicopter growing louder, which meant that the extraction was only minutes away. However, those minutes might as well have been hours given the intensity of the firefight they were still engaged in. Every step toward the landing zone required careful coordination between the carry team and the soldiers providing security. The last 100 meters to the extraction point were completely open ground, just as Richardson had warned. There was no cover except for a few scattered rocks and a low stone wall that wouldn't stop rifle bullets. This would be the most dangerous part of the entire operation, requiring perfect timing and maximum suppressive fire from Richardson's remaining team members. Set Johnson down, Maria instructed the carry team as they reached the edge of the open area. She needed to check his condition one more time before they made the final dash to the helicopter. The specialist's pulse was weak but steady, and his breathing remained stable. The tourniquet was holding, and there were no signs of additional bleeding. Richardson moved up to their position, his rifle ready and his eyes scanning the surrounding buildings for enemy movement. The Major's calm presence was reassuring, but Maria could see the strain on his face. Managing a tactical withdrawal while protecting wounded personnel was one of the most difficult challenges any military leader could face. "The bird will be on the ground for exactly 2 minutes," Richardson told the team. "We make this run together, and we all get on that helicopter. Nobody gets left behind." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of absolute commitment. This was the kind of leadership that inspired soldiers to follow their commanders into impossible situations. The sound of the helicopter was now directly overhead, and Maria could see the aircraft beginning its descent toward the designated landing zone. The pilot was taking significant risk by landing in an area that was still under enemy fire, but he understood that Johnson's life depended on immediate medical evacuation. "Go, go, go!" Richardson shouted as the helicopter touched down. The carry team immediately lifted Johnson and began running across the open ground toward the aircraft. Maria could see the door gunner laying down suppressive fire at the surrounding buildings, trying to keep the enemy shooters from targeting the evacuation. The run to the helicopter seemed to take forever, even though it was probably less than 30 seconds. Maria could hear bullets cracking through the air around them, and she knew that enemy snipers were trying to target the carry team. The fact that they hadn't been hit yet was due to a combination of Richardson's suppressive fire and pure luck. They reached the helicopter just as the enemy fire reached its peak intensity. Maria and the carry team loaded Johnson into the aircraft while Richardson's remaining soldiers formed a defensive perimeter around the landing zone. The helicopter crew immediately began preparing for takeoff, while the door gunner continued his suppressive fire. "Get on board, Santos!" Richardson yelled over the noise of the helicopter engines. Maria hesitated for a moment, knowing that her medical skills might be needed during the flight to keep Johnson stable. However, she also knew that Richardson's team was still in extreme danger and that they might need her medical services before this operation was over. The decision was made for her when a mortar round exploded about 50 meters from the landing zone. The blast threw dirt and debris over everyone, and Maria could see that at least one of Richardson's soldiers had been knocked down by the concussion. Her medical instincts overrode her desire to stay with Johnson, and she jumped back off the helicopter. "I'm staying with the team," she called out to the helicopter crew. Johnson was stable enough for the flight medic to handle during transport, but Richardson's soldiers were still in immediate danger and might need her services. It was a decision that went against standard medical evacuation procedures, but it felt right given the circumstances. The helicopter lifted off immediately, taking Johnson toward the military hospital where he could receive the surgical care he needed. Maria watched it disappear into the distance while automatic weapons fire continued to crack around their position. Now she had to focus on keeping the rest of Richardson's team alive long enough for their own extraction. Richardson appeared at her side, his face showing a mixture of respect and concern for her decision to stay behind. "That was either very brave or very stupid, Santos," he said with a slight smile. Despite the desperate nature of their situation, he seemed genuinely pleased that she had chosen to remain with the team. "Probably both, sir," Maria replied as she checked on the soldier who had been knocked down by the mortar blast. Sergeant Williams was conscious but disoriented, with a possible concussion from the explosion. He would need monitoring, but he was still capable of fighting if necessary. The enemy fire seemed to be coming from every direction now, and Richardson's remaining ammunition was running dangerously low. The Major was trying to coordinate with their base for additional support, but the radio communications were being jammed by the insurgents. Their situation was becoming increasingly desperate with each passing minute. Maria realized that they were now cut off from friendly forces and surrounded by an unknown number of enemy fighters. Richardson's team was down to 6 effective soldiers plus herself, and their ammunition situation was critical. Without immediate support, they might not survive the next hour. "We need to break contact and move to an alternate extraction point," Richardson told his team during a brief lull in the fighting. The original landing zone was now too heavily defended for another helicopter to land safely. They would have to fight their way to a new location while carrying their wounded and dealing with dwindling ammunition supplies. As they prepared to move, Maria noticed that Richardson was favoring his left arm. Blood was visible on his sleeve, indicating that he had been hit during the firefight. The major was trying to hide his wound from his soldiers, not wanting to add another medical concern to their already desperate situation. "Sir, you're hit," Maria said quietly, moving toward Richardson to assess his injury. The major tried to wave her off, but she insisted on examining the wound. It appeared to be a grazing shot to his upper arm, painful, but not immediately life-threatening. "It's nothing," Richardson insisted, but Maria could see that he was losing blood and would need treatment soon. The wound might not be fatal, but it would affect his ability to lead the team if it wasn't properly treated. She quickly applied a field dressing while Richardson continued to coordinate their defensive efforts. The sound of enemy voices could be heard from the surrounding buildings, indicating that the insurgents were coordinating their own tactical movements. Richardson's team was running out of time, ammunition, and options. They needed to make their move toward the alternate extraction point immediately before they were completely surrounded and overwhelmed. As they prepared to leave their current position, a sniper's bullet struck the wall inches from Richardson's head. The major stumbled backward, momentarily stunned by the near miss. Maria could see that the wound to his arm was affecting his balance and reaction time more than he was willing to admit. The sniper's near miss seemed to galvanize the enemy forces, and suddenly, their fire became more coordinated and intense. Richardson staggered again, this time not from the shock of the bullet, but from blood loss. Maria could see that his wound was worse than either of them had initially thought, and he was beginning to show signs of going into shock. "Sir, we need to get you to better cover," Maria said, grabbing Richardson by his good arm. She could see that he was trying to maintain command of the situation, but his physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. The combination of blood loss and the stress of combat leadership was taking its toll on the major. Richardson resisted her attempt to move him, still trying to direct his team's defensive fire. "The team needs leadership," he insisted through gritted teeth. "I can't leave them now." His dedication to his soldiers was admirable, but Maria could see that he was in no condition to continue making complex tactical decisions. Another burst of enemy fire forced both of them to take cover behind a damaged concrete wall. As they pressed themselves against the barrier, Maria could hear Richardson's breathing becoming labored. His face was pale, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. She knew that he needed immediate medical attention, or he would collapse within minutes. "Martinez, Williams, maintain suppressive fire on the building to our east," Richardson called out, his voice still strong despite his physical condition. His soldiers responded immediately, their trust in his leadership unshaken even as enemy bullets continued to impact around their positions. Maria began preparing in 4-line for Richardson, knowing that he needed fluid replacement to combat the effects of blood loss. However, she also realized that their tactical situation was becoming impossible. They were outnumbered, low on ammunition, and now their commanding officer was wounded. Someone needed to take decisive action soon, or they would all be killed. The enemy fire suddenly intensified from a new direction, indicating that the insurgents had successfully flanked Richardson's position. Maria could see muzzle flashes from windows that had been empty moments before, and she realized that they were about to be surrounded completely. The tactical situation had deteriorated beyond Richardson's ability to manage. especially in his current condition. Contact left. Contact left. Sergeant Williams shouted as he directed fire toward the new enemy positions. The team's ammunition situation was becoming critical, and Maria could see that some of the soldiers were down to their last few magazines. They needed to either receive immediate reinforcement or find a way to break contact and withdraw. Richardson tried to stand up to get a better view of the tactical situation, but his legs gave out beneath him. Maria caught him as he fell, and she could see that he was losing consciousness from blood loss. The major's wound had reopened, and blood was soaking through the field dressing she had applied earlier. "Williams, take command," Richardson managed to say before his eyes closed. The sergeant immediately acknowledged the order and began coordinating the team's defensive efforts, but Maria could see that he was overwhelmed by the complexity of their situation. Williams was an excellent soldier, but he lacked Richardson's experience in managing complex tactical problems. Maria laid Richardson down in the most protected position she could find and began working to stabilize his condition. She applied a pressure bandage to his wound and started another 4-line, but she knew that he needed surgical intervention soon or he would die from blood loss. The irony was that she was now treating the same kind of arterial bleeding that had nearly killed Johnson earlier. While Maria worked on Richardson, she could hear the tactical situation continuing to deteriorate around them. Williams was doing his best to coordinate defensive fire, but the team was being overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Enemy voices could be heard from multiple directions now, indicating that they were almost completely surrounded. "Santos, we need to move now," Williams called out. The sergeant had identified a potential escape route through a partially collapsed building, but it would require abandoning their current defensive position. More importantly, it would mean carrying Richardson through dangerous terrain while he was unconscious and critically wounded. Maria looked down at Richardson's pale face and made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. The major had risked his life to save his soldiers throughout this entire firefight, and she was not going to let him die because they couldn't carry him to safety. If they were going to get out of this situation alive, someone needed to take charge and make the hard decisions. "Williams, get the team ready to move," Maria ordered, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even herself. "I'll handle the major's evacuation." She had never commanded soldiers in combat before, but her medical training had taught her to take charge in crisis situations, and this was certainly the biggest crisis of her life. The sergeant looked at her with surprise, but he could see the determination in her eyes. Williams had served with Maria long enough to know that she was competent under pressure, and their current situation left them few options. He nodded his acknowledgement and began preparing the team for movement. Maria rigged a makeshift stretcher using Richardson's combat vest and 2 broken pieces of wood from the surrounding debris. The major was still unconscious, but his vital signs had stabilized enough for transport. She knew that moving him in this condition was dangerous, but leaving him behind would be certain death. As the team prepared to move, enemy fire began impacting their position from yet another direction. The insurgents had completed their encirclement, and escape was now going to require fighting through enemy positions while protecting wounded personnel. Maria realized that their situation had become a classic tactical nightmare. "Santos, we've got enemy movement in the building we need to go through," Williams reported. The escape route they had identified was now occupied by insurgent fighters, and alternative routes would expose them to even more enemy fire. They were effectively trapped with a wounded commander and minimal ammunition. Maria looked at Richardson's rifle lying beside his unconscious form and made another decision that would change everything. She had been trained as a medic, but every soldier in Richardson's unit was also trained as a rifleman. Her marksmanship scores had always been excellent, and she had distinguished herself in combat training exercises. "Williams, take point and get the team ready to assault through that building," Maria ordered as she picked up Richardson's weapon. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, even though she had spent most of her deployment focused on medical duties. Today, she would have to be both a medic and a soldier. The M4 carbine was loaded with a full magazine, and Maria could see that Richardson had several spare magazines attached to his combat vest. She quickly redistributed the ammunition and checked the weapon's condition. Everything seemed to be in working order, and she felt a surge of confidence as she prepared for what would be the most important firefight of her life. "Are you sure about this, Santos?" Williams asked. The sergeant respected her medical skills, but leading an assault through enemy-occupied terrain was far different from treating wounded soldiers. One mistake could get the entire team killed, and they were already in an extremely precarious position. "We don't have any choice," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Richardson trusted us to get his people home safely, and that's exactly what we're going to do." She looked around at the remaining members of the team, seeing fear mixed with determination in their faces. The plan was simple, but extremely dangerous. Maria would lead the assault on the occupied building while Williams and the other soldiers provided covering fire and protected Richardson's unconscious form. Once they had cleared the immediate threat, the entire team would move through the building toward the alternate extraction point. As Maria prepared to begin the assault, she thought about Richardson's leadership throughout this entire operation. The major had put his soldiers' safety ahead of his own, and now it was her turn to do the same. She chambered a round in Richardson's rifle and prepared to make history. Maria's assault on the enemy-occupied building began with a calculated burst of suppressive fire that caught the insurgents by surprise. Her marksmanship training took over as she moved with deliberate precision, using the same methodical approach that had made her an excellent medic. Every shot was carefully aimed, every movement purposeful and controlled. The first insurgent fell before he even realized that the American position had changed from defensive to offensive. Maria's tactical understanding, developed through months of observing Richardson's leadership, guided her movements as she advanced on the building. She used cover effectively, communicated clearly with her team, and maintained the aggressive momentum necessary for a successful assault. Williams and the remaining soldiers provided excellent supporting fire, their trust in Maria's sudden leadership evident in their professional execution of her orders. The team moved like a well-oiled machine, each soldier understanding his role in the complex operation they were conducting. Richardson's training had prepared them for this moment, even though none of them had expected to be led by their unit medic. As Maria reached the building's entrance, she could hear enemy voices inside indicating confusion and panic. The insurgents had not expected such an aggressive response from a trapped American unit, and their defensive preparations were focused on containing rather than repelling an assault. This tactical miscalculation would cost them dearly. The door to the building hung partially open, providing Maria with a clear view of the interior layout. She could see two insurgents positioned near windows on the opposite side of the room, both focused on maintaining fire against Williams and the other soldiers. A third fighter was positioned near a staircase leading to the upper floor, apparently coordinating the defensive efforts through a handheld radio. Maria's assault through the doorway was swift and decisive. Her first shots dropped the insurgent near the staircase before he could react to her presence. The two fighters near the windows turned toward the new threat, but Maria had already moved to a covered position behind an overturned table. Her medical training had taught her to work efficiently under pressure, and those same skills now applied to combat operations. The firefight inside the building lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours to Maria. She moved from position to position with the same methodical precision she used when treating wounded soldiers, each action calculated to achieve maximum effectiveness with minimum risk. Her shooting was accurate and controlled, wasting no ammunition while neutralizing threats efficiently. When the last insurgent fell, Maria immediately began clearing the upper floor to ensure that no additional threats remained. The building was empty except for the 3 fighters she had already engaged, but she knew that thoroughness was essential for her team's survival. Richardson had taught them that incomplete clearing operations could be fatal mistakes. Building secure. Maria called out to Williams and the team. She could hear the relief in their voices as they responded, confirming that they were ready to move Richardson through the cleared structure. The assault had been successful, but they still needed to reach the alternate extraction point before enemy reinforcements arrived. Williams and two other soldiers carried Richardson's unconscious form into the building, while Maria maintained security at the exits. The Major's condition had remained stable during the firefight, but he still needed immediate surgical intervention. Time was becoming critical for both Richardson's medical situation and their overall tactical circumstances. The team moved through the building quickly but carefully, with Maria leading the way toward their intended exit. She had studied the terrain during their initial approach to the village, and she knew that the alternate extraction point was approximately 300 meters beyond the building through relatively open ground. As they prepared to leave the building's rear exit, Maria could hear helicopter rotors in the distance again. Their extraction was approaching, but they still needed to cover dangerous ground while protecting wounded personnel. The tactical challenge was similar to their earlier evacuation of Johnson, but now Maria was responsible for making the critical decisions. Same formation as before, Maria told the team. I'll take point. Williams and Martinez carry the Major. Stevens provides rear security. We move fast, and we move together. Nobody gets left behind. Her words echoed Richardson's earlier commands, maintaining the leadership continuity that was essential for the team's morale. The movement to the extraction point tested every aspect of Maria's newfound leadership abilities. She had to balance speed with security, ensuring that they moved quickly enough to reach the helicopter before enemy reinforcements arrived, while maintaining sufficient tactical awareness to avoid additional ambushes. Her medical background helped her monitor Richardson's condition during the movement, but her combat training guided their tactical approach. Enemy fire followed them during the first 100 meters of their movement, but it was disorganized and largely ineffective. The insurgents were apparently regrouping after the loss of their forward positions, and they had not yet re-established effective fire control. Maria's aggressive assault had disrupted their tactical coordination more than she had initially realized. The helicopter came into view as they reached the final approach to the landing zone, and Maria could see that the pilot was already preparing for a rapid extraction. The aircraft crew had obviously been briefed on the tactical situation, and they understood that time was critical for both the wounded soldier and the overall mission success. LZ in sight. Maria called out to her team. She could see that Richardson was beginning to regain consciousness, his eyes fluttering as the four fluids began to restore his blood pressure. The Major tried to speak, but Maria quickly reassured him that everything was under control and that the team was safely moving toward extraction. The final sprint to the helicopter was completed without enemy contact, and Maria felt a surge of relief as her team reached the relative safety of the aircraft's defensive perimeter. Richardson was loaded onto the helicopter first, followed by the rest of the team. As Maria climbed aboard, she realized that she was still carrying Richardson's rifle, the weapon that had enabled her to lead the successful assault. During the flight back to base, Richardson regained full consciousness and was briefed on what had happened after he lost consciousness. His expression showed a mixture of pride and amazement as he learned about Maria's leadership during the crisis. The Major had always known that his medic was capable, but her performance under extreme combat conditions exceeded even his highest expectations. Santos, Richardson said weakly as the medical team at the base hospital prepared to take him into surgery. That was some of the finest leadership I've ever seen in combat. You saved all our lives today. His words carried the weight of absolute sincerity, and Maria could see genuine respect in his eyes. The after-action reports from that day would eventually reach the highest levels of military command, documenting how combat medic had successfully led an assault that saved her entire team. Maria's actions demonstrated that leadership could emerge from unexpected sources when circumstances demanded it, and that medical training could provide a foundation for tactical excellence. In the weeks that followed, as Richardson recovered from his surgery and the team was debriefed on their experiences. Maria found herself being considered for combat leadership positions that would have been unthinkable before that firefight. Her demonstration of courage under fire had proven that she possessed the qualities necessary for military command, regardless of her primary military specialty. The rifle she had carried that day was returned to Richardson when he was released from the hospital, but the major insisted that she keep it as a reminder of her extraordinary performance. The weapon became a symbol of the day when a medic had saved her commander's life, seized his rifle, and made military history through her courage and leadership under impossible circumstances. Years later, when Maria had risen through the ranks to become a major herself, she would tell young soldiers that leadership was not about rank or position, but about the willingness to take responsibility when others needed you most. Her story became an inspiration throughout the military, proving that heroes could emerge from any background when duty called and lives were at stake.